The wind howled like a hungry wolf against the walls of the tiny frontier clinic, but the real storm wasn't outside. It was inside, in the body of a 7-year-old girl. Her name was Abby McKenna, and she was shaking herself to pieces on a narrow cot. Her muscles were locked tight. Her lips had turned a dusky blue, and her breaths came in ragged, desperate gasps. Rose Callahan, a nurse with hands as steady as the Wyoming mountains, held the child's small shoulders. She tried to keep her from harm, but this was a fight Rose was losing. "Hold her steady," Dr. Alden barked. His voice was sharp, cutting through the rattling of the kerosene lamps. He was a man of science, a man of bitter medicines and cold steel. He reached for a vial of laudanum, the dark, potent liquid they used when things got this bad. He grumbled, fumbling for a syringe. "She won't last if this keeps up." But Rose wasn't looking at the medicine. She was looking into Abby's eyes. They were wide, glassy, reflecting a terror that went deeper than just pain. It struck Rose like an arrow to the heart. This wasn't just the body failing. This was the soul screaming. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was filled with an authority that made the doctor pause. "Give me 1 minute." Dr. Alden shot her a look that could curdle milk, a look that demanded obedience. But Rose didn't back down. She had seen this kind of storm before, and she knew a syringe wasn't the answer. She slid her arms under Abby's frail body, lifting the girl against her chest. Abby's head lolled back. Then her body jerked again, fighting an invisible demon. Rose held her tight, cradling her as if she were made of spun glass, and began to sway. And then she sang. Her voice was rough from exhaustion, but it was clear and true. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The sound filled the small, cramped room. The flickering lamplight seemed to lean in, listening. The other nurse froze. The doctor's hand stopped its motion. The world held its breath. As Rose sang, something impossible began to happen. The violent rhythm of Abby's convulsions started to slow. Her rigid little body began to loosen, just a fraction at a time, but Rose felt it. The change was real. She pressed her cheek against the child's damp hair, ignoring the doctor's impatient glare, and continued to sing. "You make me happy when skies are gray." By the time she reached the final verse, the storm inside the little girl had broken. Abby's clenched fists relaxed. Her breathing steadied, no longer a frantic fight for air. The terrifying tremors softened into simple exhaustion. A profound silence fell over the clinic. Even the wind outside seemed to have paused its assault. Rose laid Abby gently back on the cot, smoothing the hair from her damp forehead. Dr. Alden stared, dumbfounded. He muttered something under his breath, scribbled a quick, angry note on the child's chart, and stormed out of the room without another word. The other nurse just watched Rose, her mouth slightly open, a million questions in her eyes. But she said nothing. But they weren't the only ones who had witnessed the miracle. Hidden behind a heavy curtain at the far end of the room, a man had been standing, frozen. Elias McKenna, Abby's father. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, but he carried the weary weight of a man who had buried his wife far too young. He was clutching the curtain so tightly, his knuckles were white, as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. 2 years. It had been 2 long, silent years since he'd lost his wife, Margaret. But the sound of that lullaby, that specific song, pierced him like a lightning strike. It was her song, Margaret's song. She used to sing it to Abby every single night, her voice a soft melody in a house that was once filled with love and laughter. Since the funeral, that house had been a tomb of silence, until now. Elias's breath caught in his chest. He watched this nurse, this stranger, settle his daughter with a tenderness he thought had died with his wife. She hadn't just stopped a seizure. She had ripped open a wound in his heart he'd tried so desperately to seal shut. He saw Rose pull a chair to the cot, her expression calm and determined. She was going to stay the night. Elias turned and slipped away before she could see him, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. His chest ached with a feeling so painful and so warm it felt like a dead limb slowly, agonizingly coming back to life. The wind howled again, but now, woven into its lonely sound, was the echo of a lullaby. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that something had just begun, that he would have no power to stop. By dawn, the clinic smelled of stale coffee and smoke. Rose hadn't moved from her chair all night. When Abby finally stirred, she opened her eyes, and there was no fear in them. Just a quiet curiosity. She reached out a small, hesitant hand and brushed her fingers against Rose's sleeve. It was the first gesture of trust, the first real connection Abby had made with anyone in 2 years. And then she slipped back into a peaceful sleep. Rose felt her throat tighten. She had come to Wyoming to escape, to bury her feelings under the heavy blanket of duty. But this child's simple touch had found a crack in her armor. Her mind, against her will, flashed back to another child, another night. Her nephew. A terrible accident. A frantic ride for help that ended in a tragedy she could never outrun. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the memory away. Duty. That's all this was. The clinic door creaked open. Elias stood there, his hat in his hands, his face etched with exhaustion. His gaze went from Abby, sleeping peacefully, to Rose. He just looked at her for a long moment, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "You stayed the night," he finally said, his voice low and rough. "It was necessary," Rose replied, keeping her voice flat, not meeting his eyes. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, heavy with unspoken words. He wanted to say more, to ask the question that was burning in his mind. How did you know that song? But he wasn't ready, and looking at her guarded face, he knew she wasn't ready either. He left without another word. But as the door closed, the air in the room had changed. It was charged with questions, with memories, with the fragile beginnings of hope. Rose looked down at Abby, then at her own hands. She had come to this town to heal others, but she was beginning to suspect that the one person who needed healing most was herself. The morning light did little to warm Rose's small one-room cabin on the edge of town. The place was neat, almost unnaturally so. Not because she loved order, but because chaos reminded her of the life she'd lost. A single framed photograph stood on her small table, an object of warmth in a room of cold necessity. It was a picture of her and her sister, Hannah, taken in the sun-drenched summer before everything went wrong. Rose picked up the frame, her thumb tracing the outline of Hannah's smiling face. The memory hit her like a physical blow. 5 years. It felt like yesterday. Hannah's little boy, just a toddler, had taken a tumble. It was nothing serious, a bump on the head, but Rose had panicked. Instead of handling it, she had sent a frantic message for Hannah to come home. Hannah had ridden her horse through a blinding downpour to get there. She never made it. A supply wagon, its driver blinded by the storm, struck her at the crossroads. The boy was fine. Hannah was not. Guilt was a poison Rose had been swallowing every day since. She told herself it was an accident, but in the dark, quiet hours of the night, she knew the truth. Her panic had cost her sister her life, so she had built a fortress around her heart, with walls made of duty and long hours. She had promised herself she would never again get close enough to anyone to cause such pain. And then Abby McKenna had looked at her with those terrified blue eyes. Later that day, back at the clinic, the routine of work was a comfort. Bandaging a cowboy's cut hand, mixing a tincture for an old woman's cough. She tried to focus on the familiar tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to Abby, to the feel of the child's small body relaxing in her arms. Medicine had rules, doses, predictable outcomes. What had happened last night defied all of it. The door creaked open, and Elias McKenna filled the doorway once more. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. "I came to thank you," he said, his voice quiet, careful. "Properly this time?" Rose looked up from her notes, caught off guard. "Your daughter is a fighter. She's strong." "No," Elias said, shaking his head. "She quieted because of you. I've never seen anything like it. Not since Margaret." His voice cracked on his late wife's name. He cleared his throat, his gaze intense. "You stayed. That meant more than you know." Rose wanted to brush it off, to call it professional duty. But she saw the raw grief in his eyes, a grief she knew all too well. And she saw something else there, too, a question, a plea for connection that terrified her. So she just nodded, unable to speak. Elias seemed to understand. He put his hat back on his head. "Good day, Nurse Callahan." He turned and left, his boots echoing on the boardwalk. Rose sat frozen, her pen still poised over the page. A man's gratitude was a dangerous thing. It built bridges where she needed walls. And yet, his voice, thick with a pain that mirrored her own, lingered in the air. The lullaby she had sung, a song she thought was just for a frightened child, had become something more. It was a key, and it had unlocked a door in both of them. A door she was desperate to slam shut. The McKenna house was less a home and more a museum of a life that had ended 2 years ago. Books lined every wall, Margaret's books, filled with poetry and stories she used to read aloud. Now they just gathered dust. Elias had tried to keep his book-selling business going, but his heart wasn't in it. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving him a ghost in his own home. Abby was a ghost, too. She moved through the silent rooms without a sound, a pale shadow of the happy child she once was. Since the night at the clinic, she was calmer, the seizures held at bay, but the silence remained. Every day, Elias would bring her back to the clinic for observation. And every day, the same thing would happen. Abby would walk straight to Rose, placing her small hand into the nurse's without a word. She clung to Rose as if she were a lifeline. Elias watched this happen, and his heart was torn in two. He was relieved that his daughter was finding comfort, but he was uneasy because that comfort came from a woman who carried his wife's song on her lips. It bound him to her in ways he wasn't ready to face. The town noticed, of course. Whispers followed Rose like her shadow. "The McKenna girl only has eyes for that nurse now," they'd murmur at the general store. Elias heard it all, but he said nothing. He was too lost in his own confusion. One evening, he lingered at the clinic after all the other patients had gone. Rose was cleaning instruments, her sleeves rolled up, her face tired in the lamplight. "You've done more for her in a few weeks than I have in 2 years," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Rose didn't look up from her work. "She doesn't need medicine," she said, her voice sharp. "She needs someone who won't leave." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Because it was the truth. He had been there physically, but his spirit had left with Margaret. He was a ghost, and his daughter knew it. He left without another word, the shame heavy on his shoulders. That night, he found himself walking the dark, empty streets of the town. He ended up outside the clinic. A single lamp was still burning. He could see Rose inside, bent over her medical texts, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't like the other women in town, concerned with gossip and appearances. She carried a weight inside her, a sorrow that he recognized. And maybe that's why Abby trusted her, because she recognized it too. Back home, he opened a small wooden box he kept hidden in his room. Inside were Margaret's things, a locket, a pressed flower, and the folded sheet music, "For You Are My Sunshine." He traced the notes with his finger, and the grief washed over him again, fresh and sharp. But this time, something else was mixed in with it. A tiny, fragile ember of hope. The memory of Abby, safe and calm in Rose's arms. The next morning, Abby padded into his study and placed a book in his lap. It was one of Margaret's favorites. Abby looked at him, her silent plea unmistakable. "Read to me?" His hands trembled as he opened the book, his voice rusty from disuse. He read, and for the first time in a long time, Abby didn't seem to be looking through him, but at him. When he finished, however, her gaze drifted to the window, as if she were searching for someone else. He knew who. That night, lying awake, listening to the wind, Elias finally admitted the truth to himself. He needed Rose Callahan. He told himself it was for Abby. But as he thought of her, alone in her small cabin at the edge of town, he knew it was more than that. Her quiet strength, her hidden pain, the song that connected them all, it had woken something in him. And he understood, with a terrifying clarity, that if his daughter's healing depended on Rose, then so did his. The wind had a bitter edge to it the morning Rose walked into the clinic. A thin layer of frost coated the windows, and the air inside was thick with a tension she could feel the moment she stepped through the door. The usual morning chatter stopped. Every eye in the waiting room turned to her. It was a look she knew well, the look of judgment. Dr. Alden came out of his office, his face a grim mask. He was holding a piece of paper. "Nurse Callahan," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "A word." Rose felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "There's a problem," he continued, not bothering to lower his voice. "The blood samples from young Samuel Turner, the ones we sent to Cheyenne for testing, they never arrived." He peered at her over his spectacles, his eyes like chips of ice. "The courier is adamant. He never received the crate from us, which is strange because my logbook shows you were the one who prepared it for him." The waiting room erupted in a low buzz of whispers. The words struck Rose like a physical blow. "You think I lost them?" "I don't think," Alden snapped, his voice ringing with authority. "I know the samples were last seen in your care. A boy's life is at stake, nurse, and until this matter is resolved, I am suspending your duties. Effective immediately." Her face burned with shame. "Doctor, I swear to you I packed them myself. I sealed the crate. I placed it by the door for the courier, just like always." "And yet, it's gone," he said, his voice dripping with false pity. "Mistakes happen. But in our line of work, a mistake can be a death sentence." He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal. The silent accusation of the entire room pressed down on her. Years of careful work, of building a reputation for precision and care, all of it shattered in an instant. She grabbed her satchel, her fingers stiff and numb, and walked out of the clinic. She didn't run, but every step was an agony. The whispers followed her down the boardwalk, chasing her, branding her as careless, incompetent. By the time she reached her cold, empty cabin, her pride was in tatters. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, drawing the blood, sealing the vials, packing the crate. She had done everything right. Someone else had made the mistake, so why was she the one being punished? Anger began to bubble up through the despair. This wasn't fair. Just as dusk was settling, a sharp knock echoed on her door. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. She opened it to find Elias McKenna standing on her doorstep, his hat in his hands. Abby was with him, peeking out from behind his long coat. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low and steady. Rose braced herself for more pity, more accusation. "Then you know I've been fired." "No," Elias said firmly, his gaze meeting hers without a flicker of doubt. "I came to tell you I don't believe a word of it." The air left Rose's lungs in a rush. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. "I've built my business on shipping and couriers," he went on. "I know how often things go missing. This isn't your fault, Rose." He said her name, her first name. It sounded strange and yet right. Just then, Abby tugged on his sleeve and reached a small hand out towards Rose. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Rose knelt down and took the child's hand. Abby's grip was surprisingly strong. In her clear blue eyes, Rose saw everything she had forgotten she deserved. Trust, belief, kindness. It was almost too much to bear. "Thank you, Abby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Elias cleared his throat. "I'm going to find out what happened to that crate. I have contacts in Cheyenne, men who hear things. If it was stolen or just misplaced, I'll get to the bottom of it." Rose looked up at him, bewildered. "Why would you do that for me?" He looked from her to his daughter, whose hand was still gripping hers tightly. "Because you saved my daughter," he said simply, "and because everyone deserves to have someone in their corner." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the loose shutters of her cabin. No one had ever offered to stand in her corner before. No one. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and led Abby away into the growing darkness. Rose closed the door and leaned against it, her legs suddenly weak. The weight of the accusation hadn't vanished, but it felt lighter now. For the first time in 5 long years, she wasn't entirely alone. And in the center of town, as Elias lifted his daughter into their wagon, he felt a cold anger settle in his gut. Rose Callahan was not a careless woman. He was going to prove it. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was no longer just about his daughter's healing. It was about his, too. The Grand Hotel in Cheyenne was a world away from Rose's small cabin. Lamplight glittered on polished brass. Music from a string quartet drifted through the air, and the scent of expensive perfume hung heavy in the ballroom. Rose stood at the entrance, her hands clammy inside her gloves, feeling as out of place as a field mouse at a king's banquet. But Elias had insisted. He had shown up at her cabin a few days earlier with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a gown of sapphire blue silk, elegant and simple. "It was Margaret's," he had explained, his voice gentle. "She wore it once. I'd be honored if you would wear it to the clinic fundraiser." The offer had tied her stomach in knots. To accept felt like stepping into a ghost's shoes. But to refuse felt like it would break something fragile that was growing between them. So she had said yes. Now, standing beside him, with Abby clutching his hand, she felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. Elias looked handsome and confident in his dark suit. Rose, in Margaret McKenna's dress, felt like an imposter. The ballroom was a dizzying whirl of satin gowns and starched collars. Elias introduced her to ranchers and bankers and their wives. She smiled, she nodded, she tried to make polite conversation, but her own rough hands and plain speech felt glaringly obvious. Then she heard it, a whisper, sharp and cruel, from 2 women standing by the refreshment table. "Is that Margaret's dress?" one of them hissed. "It is," the other replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "How pitiful! Dressing up the nurse to look like his dead wife. Some men just can't let go." The words were like a dagger in her heart. The music faded. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock her. She caught her reflection in a large mirror and saw what they saw. Not Rose Callahan, but a pale imitation of another woman. A placeholder. She looked for Elias, but he was deep in conversation with a senator, oblivious. She had to get out. She couldn't breathe. Mumbling a quick excuse, she pushed her way through the laughing, chattering crowd and fled out into the cold night air. The icy wind was a relief on her burning cheeks. She ran, lifting the hem of the beautiful silk gown out of the mud, her only thought to get away, to escape the whispers, to escape the ghost she had been dressed up to be. Back in the safety of her cabin, she stripped off the gown. She folded it with reverent care and laid it on the table. Then she collapsed onto her cot and let the sobs come. It wasn't just the dress. It was the sudden, brutal realization of the truth. She was a stand-in. Abby clung to her because she sang Margaret's song. Elias trusted her because she had a shadow of Margaret's kindness. But Rose herself? The woman with the haunted past and the guilty secret. No one saw her. She was invisible. Her hand shaking, she pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. "Dr. Alden," she wrote, the words stark and final. "I hereby resign my position, effective immediately." She signed her name, folded the note, and placed it on top of the sapphire blue gown. In the morning, she would send them both back. She would disappear. It was the only way. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind, every memory of Abby's trust and Elias's kindness now feeling like a lie. Across town, Elias searched the ballroom in a growing panic. When he finally realized she was gone, a cold dread washed over him. He carried a sleepy Abby home, his mind racing. He had been so blind. He had thought the dress was a gesture of respect, of honor. He never imagined it would be a weapon used against her. He cursed his own stupidity. As he sat by his fire, long after Abby was asleep, the image of Rose's face, pale and stricken, haunted him. He knew, with a certainty that felt like a stone in his stomach, that he had just shattered the most precious, fragile thing he had found since his wife's death, and he had no idea how to put it back together. Spring arrived in Wyoming, but it brought no warmth to the McKenna house. The silence had returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Abby had retreated back into her shell. She pushed away her food. Her eyes lost their light, and she spent her days staring out the window, waiting for someone who was never going to come. Elias tried everything. He read to her. He took her to watch the printing presses run. He even tried to sing the lullaby himself, but his voice was a poor imitation, and Abby just turned her face away. Rose, meanwhile, had taken a position at a small, remote clinic in a neighboring county. It was quiet work, lonely work. It was exactly what she thought she wanted. But every evening, as she walked back to her new, unfamiliar room, she was haunted by the ghost of a small hand in hers and the echo of a man's grateful voice. Duty was no longer enough to fill the emptiness inside her. The whispers in town had changed. Now they said Rose had been too ambitious, that she'd overstepped her bounds, and Elias McKenna had finally put her in her place. Elias heard the rumors, and each one was like a turn of the knife in his gut. He had driven her away. His foolish pride, his blindness, had hurt the two people he cared about most in the world. And now Abby was paying the price. One Saturday, the town held its annual spring fair. The main street was a riot of color and noise. Elias took Abby, hoping against hope that the festive atmosphere might lift her spirits. But she walked beside him like a little ghost, her hand limp in his, her eyes vacant. He bought her a spun sugar candy, but she just held it, forgotten, as it melted in her small fist. Then she froze. Her hand tightened in his for a second, and then she pulled away. Before Elias could react, she darted into the crowd. He called her name, his heart leaping into his throat, and pushed after her. He found her at a small stall at the very edge of the market. She had thrown herself at the legs of the woman running the stall, her arms wrapped around the woman's skirts in a desperate, silent plea. It was Rose. She looked up, startled, as Abby clung to her. She gasped, then knelt, her hands hovering for a moment before she gently held the girl's shoulders. Abby's face was buried in her dress, her small body trembling. For a long moment, the noise of the fair faded away. There was only the two of them, a silent child and the woman she had chosen. All the walls Rose had built, all the distance she had put between herself and her past, crumbled in that one desperate embrace. Elias reached them, out of breath, his hat in his hands. "I didn't," he started, but the words died in his throat. The weight of all the weeks of silence and regret hung between them. Rose stood, still holding Abby's hand. "Neither did I," she said, her voice quiet. He looked at his daughter, then back at Rose. He could see the exhaustion and the pain in her eyes, but he could also see the love she had for his child, a love she had tried to deny. "She's not well," Rose said, her professional tone a thin veil over her emotion. "She's been getting worse since you left," Elias admitted, the confession raw and honest. "I've tried everything. Nothing works." Rose looked down at Abby, who was now looking up at her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was a plea more powerful than any words. Rose swallowed hard. "I thought leaving was the best thing. For everyone." "It wasn't," Elias said simply. The truth of it was a living thing between them, undeniable. Rose bent down and kissed the top of Abby's head. "I'll walk with you," she said softly, "for a little while." And so the three of them wandered through the fair, a strange, broken family. Elias was silent, Rose was guarded, but Abby was radiant. She never once let go of Rose's hand. For the first time in weeks, a faint smile touched her lips. When it was time to go, Rose knelt and hugged Abby tightly. "Be strong," she whispered. "I'll see you again." As she stood up, her eyes met Elias's. His gaze was filled with a desperate, unspoken question. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away down the dusty road toward her solitary life. Abby made a small, choked sound, a sound halfway between a sob and a word. Elias picked her up, holding her close, whispering reassurances he didn't feel himself. That night, Rose sat in her lamp-lit room, unable to focus on her medical notes. Her resolve had shattered. Abby needed her. And Elias. His eyes, filled with so much regret and longing, haunted her. She had tried to run, but she knew now it was useless. A thread, invisible but unbreakable, tied the three of them together, and it was pulling them back into the heart of the storm. The storm that finally broke over the town was biblical. Rain came down in solid sheets, and the wind screamed like a banshee. Inside the McKenna house, the lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Abby was on her bed, her small body seized by convulsions more violent than any that had come before. Dr. Alden stood over her, his face grim. "This is it, Elias," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "I have to administer the laudanum. It's her only chance." Elias gripped his daughter's hand, his face a mask of terror. "The last time. It nearly killed her." "We have no choice," Alden shouted, his hands shaking as he prepared the syringe. "It's this or we lose her." A massive clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations. Abby's body arched in a terrible spasm, and her lips turned a deep, frightening blue. Elias choked back a sob, convinced he was watching his daughter die. At that exact moment, the front door of the house burst open with a splintering crash. A figure stood silhouetted against the raging storm, drenched and disheveled. It was Rose. She stormed into the room, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "Don't you dare touch her with that!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that stopped Alden in his tracks. "You have no right to be here, Callahan," he sputtered. "You resigned." Rose ignored him. Her gaze was locked on Abby. And in a brief, terrifying moment of stillness between the convulsions, Abby's eyes met hers. Recognition flickered there. A plea. That was all Rose needed to see. She pushed past the doctor, slid her arms under the child's trembling body, and lifted her into her arms. "Rose," Elias breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. "She doesn't need poison," Rose said, her voice shaking but firm. She needs to be reminded that she's not alone. She began to rock, just as she had that first night, and she began to sing. Her voice, raw and broken, rose to fight the storm. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The room fell silent. Elias held his breath. Alden stared, the syringe forgotten in his hand. Slowly, miraculously, it began to work. Abby's rigid muscles started to soften. Her frantic gasps for air eased into shuddering breaths. Rose pressed her cheek to the girl's hair, tears streaming down her own face, and kept singing. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." And then, a new miracle. A sound, small and fragile, from the child in her arms. A whisper. "Rose." It was the first word she had spoken in over 2 years, and it was her name. The storm inside Abby broke. The convulsions ceased. She went limp in Rose's arms, exhausted but alive, breathing. Elias let out a choked sob of relief and buried his face in his hands. Rose gently laid Abby back on the pillows, tucking the blankets around her. The little girl's fingers weakly curled around Rose's sleeve, holding on tight. Elias moved to the bedside, his eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it looked like pain. "You saved her," he whispered. "You saved her life." Rose looked at him, then at the child, and finally she allowed herself to believe it. Elias reached out and took her hand, his grip strong and sure. "I thought I had lost everything when Margaret died," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought my life was over. But you brought the sunshine back." He held her hand over Abby's, their 3 hands joined together over the child's peaceful heart. The storm still raged outside, but inside that room, a new world had just been born. And in the quiet light of the dawn that followed, Rose knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was finally home. The grand opening of the Sunshine Room was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Elias had cleared out the front of his bookstore, replacing the dusty ledgers and dark shelves with bright, child-sized tables and chairs. The walls were lined with new books, their colorful spines a promise of adventure and magic. A simple, hand-carved sign hung over the door. Rose stood at the back of the room, her hands smoothing the front of her clean apron. She was nervous. Children from all over the county were filing in, their mothers hovering uncertainly in the doorway. It was a radical idea for a rough frontier town, a place for children to read, to play, to heal. A place built on the belief that sometimes a story is more powerful than medicine. Elias led Abby to a small stool at the front of the room. She was wearing a yellow ribbon in her hair that Rose had tied for her that morning. Her cheeks had a healthy pink glow, and her eyes were bright. She clutched a well-loved storybook in her hands. She looked back at Rose, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Abby took a deep breath, her small lips parted, and in a voice that was clear and steady, she began to read. "Once upon a time?" A collective gasp went through the room. Mothers pressed their hands to their mouths. Elias wiped a tear from his eye. The silent child was speaking. Her voice grew stronger with every word, filling the room with the simple magic of the story. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Abby beamed, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. She immediately slid off her stool and ran straight into Rose's waiting arms. Elias stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "This room is for all our children," he said. "My late wife, Margaret, always dreamed of a place like this. But it took the courage and the kindness of another to make it a reality." His eyes found Rose, and in that look, everyone in the room understood. This wasn't just about a memorial. It was about a new beginning. Later, after the crowd had thinned and children were happily curled up in corners with books, Elias came to stand beside Rose at the window. "You gave her back her voice," he said softly. Rose shook her head. She found it herself. I just gave her a safe place to look for it. You did more than that, he said, turning to face her. You walked beside me in the dark, Rose. You showed me there was still light. The whispers won't stop, Elias, she said, her old fears still a faint echo in her heart. Some people will always see me as the woman in Margaret's dress. Let them whisper, he said fiercely, taking her hand. His hand was rough and stained with printer's ink, but it felt like home. They don't know the truth. They don't know what it feels like to watch your child slip away and have her brought back by a song. I know. And Abby knows. And that's all that matters. Just then Abby ran over, her face alight with joy. She placed her small hand on top of their joined ones. Family, she whispered, the word full and whole and perfect. Rose's heart swelled, and the last of her walls came tumbling down. She knelt and pulled Abby into a fierce hug as Elias laid his hand on both of them, a silent promise, a benediction. Outside, a few stray snowflakes began to fall, a final gentle farewell from winter. But inside the sunshine room it was warm and bright, filled with the promise of countless stories yet to be told. Rose Callahan, the woman who had run from her past, had finally found her future. She wasn't a shadow or a replacement. She was herself. She was a mother. She was loved. And that was the greatest miracle of all. If you were moved by this story of hope, resilience, and the healing power of love, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next incredible story we have for you.